Well, hello everybody, and thank you ever so much for joining me in this midweek processing video where I take viewers' images and I go through my thought process of how I would go about processing those photographs, primarily in Lightroom, but this week I will be using a bit of Photoshop. The premise is that viewers send me in their images with their questions or their problems, or if they just want to see how I process an image, and I'll go through some of those things that I do, or the things that I'm thinking about when I'm processing an image. Now, this video is a long one this week, so I hope you can stay all the way to the end. If you do enjoy it, please be sure to give me the old thumbs up, as that's always appreciated. And if you do want to find other ways to support my channel, be sure to head on over to my website, where I have a number of hats and prints and other books for sale that help support this channel. So it's always appreciated. Thank you ever so much. Let's get stuck right into this photograph. All right, this week's photograph is by Anthony Crouch, and just an absolutely stunning scene from, I'm guessing, Colorado during the autumn. I've never actually been to Colorado in the fall, but it's on my list of places to go, especially when I see photographs like this. It's just spectacular. Now, this is Anthony's finished photograph, and overall it's pretty good. I mean, the contrast and the colors in the foreground are believable. They're absolutely stunning. The clouds, Anthony has done a good job in trying to maintain the highlights. What doesn't really sit well with me, though, is the exposure. It just looks a little odd. And what I mean by that is the foreground is quite a bit brighter than the top half of the image. And if you look closely, you can see where there's some kind of, it's not really, well, I guess it's haloing, where some of the parts of the sky are brighter than other parts of the sky. And I'm guessing that's where Anthony has brightened some areas, but tried to maintain the highlights in the sky, especially in the clouds here. So overall, I mean, it's a great shot, and I would be pretty happy with this. It just needs some careful attention to some of these areas, especially around the mountain. Now, Anthony didn't really have a specific question. He just wanted to see how I would process this. And also, I guess one question was how to emphasize the mountain a little bit more. So he has sent me 3 exposures. So we have one for the shadows, and we have this one here. This is just an average shot. I'm guessing this would be good for pretty much all of the shadows and the highlights in the foreground. But as you can see, the clouds are quite overexposed. And then we have this version here, which has been shot for the highlights in the clouds. So I don't think we need this exposure, but we could probably work with these 2 here. I guess the first thing you want to kind of think about is, well, what is it do I want to do with this photograph? Where do I want my viewer's attention? Ideally, I'm guessing probably in the center here, the mountain and the central portion. But as I look at this, other than the clouds, my eye goes to this foreground here, which is quite bright, and then the midground isn't so bright. This is very dark, and then we have some really great highlights in the trees here. So I'm going to try and play around with the highlights in the trees, darken the foreground a little bit, perhaps brighten up this section here, and we'll sort out the clouds by using this exposure here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to play around with this as an exposure for the foreground. I'm not even going to pay attention to the background. So as you can see, the shadows are pretty dark. So let's bring those up. So we'll bring the shadows up, and we can actually bring the blacks up. So if we push Alt or Option and adjust the slider here, you can see as it starts to get black there, that's where the blacks start to get all clogged up in the file there. So we want to bring them up just to the point where it's just starting to notice. So the exposure for the blacks is actually pretty good right there. And then the highlights, what we can do the same for the highlights, but just concentrating on the foreground. So if we grab the whites here, Option or Alt, and we'll just bring them up until you can notice down here that the whites start to get overexposed as I bring the whites up. You see that down there? So let's just bring that up to that point there. Okay, so now we have a pretty good base for our foreground, and we can adjust the color a little bit. If it's looking a little bit too blue, just warm it up ever so slightly, something like that. All right, now we're going to go to the sky. This is going to be a little trickier because the whites are going to be quite hard to hold back. But what I'm going to do with this image is I'm going to actually bring up the exposure to a point where, and actually, why don't we bring those two images in? Because we want to try and match this sky with this foreground. We want it to look, well, I want it to look more realistic without having it too dark with the foreground too bright. So I brought up the exposure, but now I'm going to bring the highlights way down, and let's hold the Option Alt key again. Oh, sorry, that's the blacks. Sorry, I'm playing around with the wrong slider here. So we're just going to bring those to the point where they're just starting to get a little bit overexposed. And actually, let's bring the highlights up. Something like that looks pretty good. Okay, so we're just going to select these two photographs that we've just worked on. Right click, photo merge, and just go to HDR. And now the clouds might have been moving a little bit, so let's just try de-ghost amount. That'll get rid of any kind of weird ghosting from moving objects in your photograph, but we'll have to do it by trial and error. So we'll try low, and I've just put it on auto settings, auto align. We'll just see how that works out. So we'll just click on that. Now this might take a little bit of time, depends on how fast your computer is, and it will create a new file for you. This is an HDR DNG. And as you can see, the exposure now is pretty good. The sky looks like it's the right exposure for the foreground. Here's the original finished image from Anthony. And you can see the sky was just a little bit dark. Here's the new version. But you can see that the highlights are still a little bit hot. So what we can do here, we can either do a global adjustment or we can just pick the sky and do that. So I think in this case, I think we're just going to do a global adjustment. So the highlights are already really low. Let's just try the whites, bring those down. So let's just zoom into this section here. Bring the whites all the way down. And even the exposure a little bit. There we go. Okay, now the overall feel for this is quite dark, so we need to bring that back up now. And let's just bring the shadows in. Let's up the exposure a little bit again. Let's check those blacks. And let's check the whites. See, the whites, they don't really get blown out until you get quite high up there. But let's keep them down quite low. Now you'll notice that the image is starting to look a little bit flat. If you compare it to Anthony's finished photograph here, What we could do is try and isolate those two items and concentrate again on the foreground and the sky. And I think that's what we'll do. So let's try the sky filter here. And it does a pretty good job actually, because it's quite well defined in this photograph. And what we're going to do is right click on that and go duplicate and invert mask. So we're doing the foreground here. And the foreground, I actually want to bring up the highlights, the whites in this case. You can see the more we bring them up, the more contrasty and punchy it gets. So again, it's to taste, like so. And we could actually warm this up ever so slightly. And if we don't like this here, we can go to the minus sign here, get a brush, see what's happening with here. We can actually just reduce the brush. You notice how it's overflowing into the clouds there, the foreground. We'll leave it on auto mask and we'll just paint in that section there. And we could do the whole mountain if you want. Make it a bit more accurate. Same over here. I don't see much. There's a little bit of bleed over here. All right. So the foreground is looking pretty nice. We can add just a little bit more contrast maybe. Bring up the exposure ever so slightly. Now, as I said earlier, the foreground looked a little bit bright to me. So I'm going to add another filter here. I'm just going to grab a linear gradient. Just bring it up here, like so. And I'm just going to bring the whites down a little bit here, and even the exposure ever so slightly, just so more attention goes to this section here. And actually, I would prefer it if this section here was brighter. So let's grab another filter. This time I'm going to grab a radial gradient. Let's just zoom out a little bit here. And what I'm going to do here is bring up the whites again. So we're bringing up the foreground, like so. That's looking pretty good. Now, the background. You'll notice that the background is looking just a little flat, especially the mountain here. So there's a number of ways we can deal with this. We could just go back to our sky filter here. But we want to kind of adjust the mountains here as well. So why don't we hit the plus sign here, grab the brush, turn off auto mask, and I'm just going to paint in this whole section here. Just to reduce the feathering, the size a little bit more. And then once I get down to this area close to the trees, I'll turn on auto mask. And it doesn't do an awesome job. And actually, if we zoom in, it's probably easier if we zoom in here. You can see it hasn't done a great job. So I'll just press Option on a Mac, and you can delete that. Now this bit might take a little bit of time, but we're just going to do it really quickly for now. Let's go up here. Just go down here. Actually, I'm going to just go over that tree. I don't think it's going to affect it that much. Something like that. And if the adjustments are so harsh that it's really noticeable, then we can address those afterwards. All right, so we got our mask. Let's just turn the mask off there. Now then, we want to add some contrast, and I'm actually going to warm this up ever so slightly as well. So I just added a bit of yellow in there. And now we can do this either by just with the sliders, which might probably work pretty good. Let's bring the blacks down ever so slightly. Perhaps bring the shadows down a bit. I'm going to add even more warmth to this. And you'll notice the highlights are starting to go out there. I'm not too concerned about those because it's quite small in the frame. But if you're concerned about those, we can add another brush. Just a normal brush. Just paint that there, and just reduce the whites like so. All right, so let's compare this to Anthony's original file here. Now Anthony has cropped it a little bit. He has a lot more contrast in the mountain. The way I usually look at this is that if you're looking at a scene like this, now this is a personal preference of mine, you're not going to have as much contrast in the scene behind as you are in the foreground. So when you look at this image, there's almost as much contrast in the background as the foreground. Now this is a personal thing of mine. To my eye, it just seems to have more depth when it has less contrast in the background, because it kind of has that atmospheric haze. But again, like I said, it's just a personal thing of mine. Okay, so let's have a critical look at this still. I still think that this foreground is still a bit bright. And actually, let's bring this up ever so slightly. And we're going to bring up the shadows a bit. All right, that's looking pretty good. Now, what I would usually do is to finish off my images, I'll often bring them into Photoshop because I just feel that I have a little bit more control in there. And actually, why don't we do that? All right, we've opened up the file in Photoshop, and the first thing I'm going to do is just do a really quick levels adjustment here. I'll often do this with all my photographs. I just find, for whatever reason, Photoshop just a little bit more accurate. As you'll notice, if I grab the slider here on the shadows, you can see that some of them are a little bit darker than I probably would have liked. So I'm just going to bring the slider back ever so slight down here. This will actually open up the shadows slightly. Especially if you're printing, you definitely don't want clogged up shadows, especially in the blacks. Same with the whites here. You'll notice the highlights option. You can see there's quite a few specular highlights here. Now it's not really a big deal. There's nothing that's way overexposed. There's a little bit of snow here and some of the leaves, so you're not going to notice those. It's just when you get large areas that it gets a little bit jarring. But having said that, I'm just going to bring this highlights down back a little bit like that. Now what I'd like to do is actually brighten up some of these highlights in the trees and that just a little bit more. So I'm going to use some luminosity masks, and I have a couple of different types here. I have Lumenzia and Tony Kuiper's panel. Basically, they're just shortcuts, and these are all the different types of luminosity masks. Now, I'm not going to go over this in great detail. There's lots of videos on YouTube about luminosity masks, and it gets a little bit dull talking about them. But what I'm going to do is I want to adjust some of the highlighted areas. So basically when you press one of these buttons, whatever you do to this photograph now, the light areas will be affected, but the dark areas won't. So L is for lights, M midtones, and D for darks. So you can see that anything that's light is the shadowed areas, and anything that's black in this is actually the highlighted areas. So I've been playing around with it a little bit. I quite like this mask here because it'll enable me to dodge some of these highlighted areas without affecting some of the shadowed areas. So I'm going to select that. And I don't want to see the marching ants, so I'm just going to go Command H, so that just hides them. And I'm just going to go to TKs here and pick the dodge tool here. So make sure it's on white paint over here. Opacity is 100%, flow, let's go with 5%. So I'm just going to zoom in on this tree here, and B for brush. Make sure that the hardness is set to 0 or close to it. And I'm just going to start brightening up some of these areas ever so slightly. And that includes the highlighted sides of these trees here, these shrubs here. And again, this is to taste, like everything you do in processing. You do as much or as little as you want. I try to do it to the point where if it starts to look a little bit, I'll go to a point where I don't want to do anymore, and then I'll just back off a little bit, because sometimes it just doesn't look right. Might look overdone. So let's just zoom out here and see how much we've actually brightened up here. So you can see where we're brightening up areas by just toggling on and off here. So I'd like to brighten up this section here, this section here, these trees here. Even these trees, even though they're in shadow, it'd be nice to just brighten up just a little bit. There's some beautiful color back there. And then here, back here. And as far as the outside goes, I'd like to darken that just ever so slightly. So I'm going to turn that mask off, Command or Control D. That turns that mask off. I'm just going to grab a burn tool here, use the same settings, 5%, 100% opacity, but it's now on black paint, and just darken some of these areas down here ever so slightly. Let's just brighten up this just ever so slightly in here. The idea is to bring attention to these foreground shrubs and keep your viewer's eye in the frame, but you don't want to overdo it. And I keep saying this, sometimes we can overdo it with too much of a good thing can just make it look really terrible. And in this case, if you do overdo it, say as I toggle on and off with the dodge tool here, if I don't like the effect, if it's just too much, then just bring it down a little bit. All right. Well, I think that's the best I can do with this photograph. I really do like the scene, and I've definitely faced these challenges in my own photography as well, where you have this wonderful scene and the contrast is just too much for the camera to handle. Like when you're standing there, you think, oh, what a beautiful scene, and you point your camera at it, and then it's somewhat disappointing when you get the photos back, because you either blown out the highlights or the shadows are just black, and it's taken all that kind of drama that you saw with your eyes out of the photograph. So, but you can bring it back, but it does take a little bit of work. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please be sure to give me a thumbs up if you did. I know it was long-winded. If you have other techniques that you would like to share on the comments down below. We're always open to that. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to give me the thumbs up. All right, folks, until next time, bye-bye.